Arthur stood on the cracked, sun-baked earth of his front pasture, gripping the wooden handle of a shovel his father had given him 40 years ago. Across the county line, the relentless hum of massive, million-dollar automated irrigation pumps roared into the afternoon sky. It was the sound of the future, or so everyone in the valley kept telling him. But Arthur had flat-out refused the shiny new automated irrigation systems, and for that, he had become the biggest joke in town. The younger generation of farmers, armed with tablets and drone footage, had laughed him right out of the local diner, mocking him for clinging to the past. They said his stubbornness was going to run the family farm straight into the ground. When the hottest drought of the decade rolled in, turning the Midwestern soil to fine dust, they were entirely convinced Arthur was finished. But Arthur wasn't looking at the sky, praying for rain like the rest of them. He was staring down at a patch of old, deep-rooted buffalo grass that, defying all logic, was still a vibrant, stubborn shade of green. He knew something the computers and the ag-tech salesman didn't. He remembered the old lessons his grandfather used to tell around the front porch on hot August nights. While his neighbor's high-tech pumps drained the local aquifer dry at record speed, Arthur was quietly preparing for the day the wells finally ran empty. And tomorrow, the laughing was going to stop. Arthur dropped to one knee, his joints popping like an old barn door in the winter wind. He dug his bare, calloused hands into the dirt just beneath that stubborn patch of buffalo grass. While the top 2 inches of the pasture were nothing but dry, unforgiving powder underneath, it was a different story. It was cool. It was damp. It was the memory of water, preserved by a method that didn't require a microchip, a monthly subscription, or a Wi-Fi connection. He thought back to the late 1970s, sitting on the front porch with his grandfather, shelling peas into a galvanized tin bucket while the cicadas hummed in the oak trees. "Water doesn't want to run away, Artie," the old man used to say, pointing a weathered, soil-stained finger at the rolling hills of their property. "It wants to hide. You just gotta give it a good, quiet place to rest." Across the county, the philosophy was entirely different, and it was playing out exactly how you'd expect. Over at the Silver Spoon Diner on Main Street, where the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee hung in the air, the morning talk was all about gallons per minute, satellite soil mapping, and Bluetooth-controlled sprinkler heads. The younger guys, folks like young Miller and the Davis brothers, sat in the corner booth comparing the data on their sleek tablets. They had taken out massive second mortgage loans from the local bank to install state-of-the-art center pivot irrigation systems. Their strategy was simple but heavily flawed. Pump as much water as possible, as fast as possible, to beat the scorching heat. They were willing to bet decades of crippling debt on the belief that the underground aquifer was a bottomless well. When Arthur had walked into the diner a week prior to pick up a black coffee, young Miller had smirked, leaning back in his vinyl booth. "Hey Art, you need me to fly my drone over your South 40. Make sure those antique seeds of yours haven't blown away into the next county." The diner erupted in chuckles. Arthur didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or get defensive. He just tipped his worn Stetson, paid for his coffee with a crinkled dollar bill, and walked out into the blazing afternoon. He didn't have the heart to tell them that their shiny new screens were blinding them to the harsh, dusty reality beneath their expensive leather boots. Back on his farm, Arthur set to work. He didn't fire up a massive, computer-guided rig. Instead, he walked past the empty stalls of the barn and pulled the heavy canvas tarp off his father's 1968 John Deere tractor, a machine of pure iron, grease, and unquestionable reliability that still purred if you knew exactly how to talk to it. For 3 weeks, while his neighbors slept and their automated systems sprayed millions of gallons of precious water into the evaporating daytime heat, Arthur worked under the pale light of the moon. He was cutting swales, gentle, almost unnoticeable ditches along the natural contour of the land. He spent hours packing these shallow trenches with old organic matter, fallen branches, dried leaves, and compost he'd been turning for years. To the untrained eye passing by on the dirt road, his fields looked like a disorganized mess of bumps and ridges. At the Sunday church social, the whispers were loud enough for him to hear. People were saying poor old Arthur had finally lost his marbles, just pushing dirt around in the dark because he was too proud to admit defeat. But Arthur knew exactly what he was doing. He was building a massive underground sponge, and he wasn't planting the genetically modified thirsty corn that the county extension office pushed every spring. He had gone deep into the cool, dark root cellar beneath the farmhouse and brought out dusty glass mason jars filled with heirloom seed, a specific strain of deep-root sorghum and drought-hardy wheat his family had carefully saved since the brutal days of the Dust Bowl. They were seeds that remembered how to survive when the sky forgot how to rain. Before we go on, if stories like this one, stories about holding on to the old ways, trusting the wisdom of our grandparents, and believing that a hard day's work still means something, remind you of the people you grew up around, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It ensures we don't lose these pieces of American history, and it really means a lot to have you with us. By mid-July, the heat became unbearable. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue that seemed to mock the valley day after day. The old AM radio in Arthur's kitchen crackled with grim news over breakfast. The county was issuing emergency water restrictions. The local reservoir was at a historic low, exposing old foundations of houses that hadn't been seen since the valley was flooded in the 50s. Arthur walked his fields at dawn, the air already thick and heavy. He knelt beside one of the earthen ridges he had built weeks ago, where the neighbors' fields were starting to show the severe stress of the relentless sun, their perfectly straight, computer-planted rows turning a sickly, pale yellow. Arthur saw it. A tiny, defiant blade of green pushing through the soil. Then another, and another. The morning dew had rolled down the gentle contours of his land, collecting exactly where he had designed it to. The buried wood was holding the moisture, feeding the deep-reaching roots of the heirloom seeds. It was a small victory, a quiet nod from the earth that the old ways still worked. But the quiet joy was short-lived. That very afternoon, a terrifying, unmistakable sound echoed across the valley. It started at the Miller farm, a low, mechanical whine that carried on the hot wind. Then, an hour later, it spread to the Davis property. It was the horrible, gut-wrenching sound of grinding metal and sputtering diesel engines. The automated pumps were sucking air. The aquifer, strained by the relentless, round-the-clock pumping of a dozen megafarms, had finally dropped below the intake pipes. Panic swept through the county like a summer wildfire. Millions of dollars in crops were suddenly entirely dependent on a sky that hadn't produced a drop of rain in 2 solid months. Trucks kicked up massive clouds of dust as farmers raced toward town, desperately calling drilling companies, offering triple the going rate to sink deeper wells before their livelihoods withered on the stalk. Arthur stood quietly on his porch, watching a heavy drilling rig barrel down the county road, leaving a trail of exhaust and desperation. He took a slow sip of his iced tea. His crops were surviving on the trapped moisture for now, but he knew they couldn't last forever without a real drink. The heat wave was intensifying, pushing his grandfather's methods to their absolute breaking point. And then, as the evening sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dry earth, Arthur noticed something strange happening at the edge of his property, down near the old forgotten limestone creek bed that hadn't held a drop of running water since the summer of 1988. The ground down there wasn't just damp, it was shifting. Arthur walked slowly down the gentle incline toward the old limestone bed, the dry, brittle grass crunching sharply beneath his leather boots. The evening air was still and heavy with the oppressive heat of the day, but as he neared the depression in the land, the temperature seemed to shift. A cool breeze, faint but unmistakable, brushed past his weathered face. He stopped at the edge of the creek bank. For over 35 years, this ravine had been nothing more than a dusty graveyard for strayed tumbleweeds and bleached river rocks. But right now, the stones at the very bottom were dark. They were glistening. He stepped down into the basin, his boots sinking slightly into the suddenly soft, giving earth. A low, rhythmic, gurgling sound reached his ears. It wasn't the aggressive, mechanical roar of a diesel pump. It was coming from the ground itself. Between a cluster of smooth, grey limestone rocks, a clear, steady stream of cold water was bubbling up to the surface. Arthur dropped to his knees, ignoring the dampness seeping into his faded denim jeans. He cupped his calloused hands, catching the icy, crystal-clear water, and splashed it over his dusty face. He let out a deep, booming laugh that startled a barn owl in the nearby oak tree. His granddaddy's method hadn't just saved the surface moisture. The massive network of swales and buried organic matter had acted like a giant subterranean funnel. Over the months, it had slowly, methodically caught every drop of morning dew, every bit of lingering frost, and fed it deep into the earth. It had completely replenished the localized shallow water table, the very water table the megafarms had completely bypassed because it wasn't deep enough for their massive intake valves. Arthur's land had become a living, breathing sponge. The water was returning to the old creek, running purely on gravity, natural design, and patience. If you believe that the best lessons in life usually come from the folks with dirt under their fingernails and a little grey in their hair, consider subscribing to our channel. We're building a community of folks who still value the old ways, and we'd be truly honoured to have you pull up a chair and join us. By the first week of August, the contrast was impossible to ignore. If you flew a plane over the county line, you'd see miles and miles of brown, withered stalks, a heartbreaking landscape of millionaire farmers watching their livelihoods literally turn to dust beneath their feet. But sitting right in the middle of that devastation was Arthur's family farm, an emerald green oasis standing defiant against the scorching summer sun. The heirloom sorghum stood tall and proud, its deep roots drinking deeply from the restored shallow water table. The wheat was swaying gently in the hot wind, heavy with grain. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. One Tuesday morning, as Arthur was sitting on his front porch whittling a piece of sweet-smelling cedar, a familiar cloud of dust appeared on the county road. It wasn't a heavy drilling rig this time. It was a brand new, polished silver pickup truck, and it pulled slowly into Arthur's dirt driveway. The engine cut off, and out stepped young Miller. He didn't look like the confident, tablet-wielding businessman from the Silver Spoon Diner anymore. His shoulders were slumped, his expensive boots were scuffed, and his face was drawn tight with the terrible stress of a man staring down the barrel of bank foreclosure. He walked up to the wooden steps of the porch, taking his baseball cap off and wringing it nervously in his hands. "Morning, Art," Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked out over the thriving green fields, then down at his boots. I don't understand it. We drilled another 100 feet on my place. Nothing but dust and bedrock. The bank is calling my house every day. And your place looks like Eden." He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "How did you do it? Please, Art, I'm going to lose my grandfather's land." Arthur stopped whittling. He looked at the young man, seeing past the arrogance of the past few months, straight to the terrified kid underneath. Arthur didn't gloat. He didn't demand an apology for the jokes and the mockery back at the diner. That just wasn't how he was raised. He simply set his pocket knife down, stood up with a small groan from his knees, and pointed a weathered finger toward the old wooden barn. "Grab a shovel, son," Arthur said gently. "I've got water to spare down by the creek to keep your livestock alive for the season. But if you want to save your soil for next year, you're gonna have to learn how to listen to the land, not just dictate to it." Word spread faster than a prairie fire. By the end of the week, the Davis brothers, the Henderson boys, and half the regular patrons of the Silver Spoon Diner were out in Arthur's fields. They weren't there to mock him anymore. They were there to learn. Under the blistering August sun, they traded their shiny iPads for heavy iron shovels. Arthur taught them how to read the natural contours of the earth, how to build proper swales, and how to use decaying wood to trap the morning moisture. He opened his dark root cellar and shared his precious, dust-covered jars of heirloom seeds, making every man promise to save the seeds from the next harvest and pass them on to their neighbors. When autumn finally arrived, bringing a crisp, much-needed chill to the Midwestern air, the county looked entirely different. Arthur's harvest was modest by commercial standards, but it was the only successful yield in the entire district. Yet, the real transformation wasn't measured in bushels or profit margins. It was measured in the restored pride of a community that had finally remembered its roots. The talk at the local diner completely shifted. You didn't hear about Bluetooth sprinklers or satellite mapping anymore. Instead, you heard the warm murmur of men and women discussing cover crops, soil health, and the old-fashioned, irreplaceable value of neighboring. Arthur never bought a new automated pump. He never needed to. He just kept sitting on his front porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon, listening to the sweet, steady sound of water running through the old limestone creek. A quiet reminder that sometimes the absolute best way forward is simply to remember what we left behind.